People who know me know that on top of being a giant nerd, I'm also a big sports fan, and especially a huge hockey fan, as you may be able to tell. My brother is a huge fan, my mom is a huge fan, and my nono's a hockey fan that would get upset at Don Cherry's terrible takes every Saturday. Saturday nights of my childhood during hockey season always followed the same script. Go to church, go to my noni's house for dinner, and tune into CBC to watch the Toronto Maple Leafs on Hockey Night in Canada. I still have the opening CBC Sports promo burned into my memory. The following is a live presentation of CBC Sports. It was more than just a sports program, it was a national institution. And the beauty of it was that it was on public television for all of Canada to watch. Most of the nation would get the Leafs game, Quebec would get the Habs, the Ottawa Valley would get the Sens games, and the entire nation would get one or two of the Oilers, Flames, and Canucks later on. Sometimes Ottawa would even play in the afternoon to make it a nationwide tripleheader. And once a year, every year, we got Hockey Day in Canada, a nationwide tripleheader in which all the Canadian teams would play usually each other. This was the norm except for the 04-05 lockout when we got Movie Night in Canada. What a dark time that was. And I think the only person that missed Movie Night was my friend Stefan. I have this distinct memory from early on in grade 7 where Stefan's telling me about how excited he is for Movie Night to come back in the fall. But I had to be the one to break it to him. Hockey was back, so Movie Night wouldn't be. He wasn't happy, but I was. And now Stefan cheers for the Minnesota Wild, so I guess he's still not happy. But hey, I'm a Leafs fan. Anyways, the history of Hockey Night in Canada during my lifetime has been a tumultuous one. By the mid-2000s, Rogers and Bell had both been building up their media empires, and people had figured that Hockey Night in Canada on CBC was on borrowed time. The first domino to fall was in 2008, when CBC lost the rights to the iconic hockey theme. This was after negotiations with composer Dolores Claman had hit an impasse. There were some reports that CBC had tried to buy the theme outright, but with a lowball offer. The rights were soon snatched up by CTV, aka Bell Media, for use in their TSN and RDS hockey broadcasts. CBC held a national contest for the new theme dubbed the Anthem Challenge. The eventual winner, Canadian Gold by composer Colin Oberst, ended up being a pretty good theme in its own right, but it was put in the unfair position of being compared to one of the greatest sports themes of all time. Unfortunately, most traces of the other entries have been pretty much wiped clean off the face of the internet, except for what remains here on YouTube. And despite a new theme, Hockey Night ran pretty much the same for the next few years. However, by 2013, it was becoming clear that CBC would not be able to retain the national broadcasting rights under the same format. Canadians' worst fears was seemingly coming true. Hockey Night wouldn't be on public television for everyone to watch, but would be ruled by the corporate overlords at Rogers or Bell. And predictably, Rogers and Bell were the only serious contenders to buy the national broadcasting rights. On November 26, 2013, it was announced that Rogers had paid $5.2 billion to broadcast the NHL nationally for 12 years, starting in the fall of 2014. That contract just ended in the spring of 2026, but more on that later. It was announced soon after that Rogers had struck a deal to keep games on the CBC, and apparently it was at the suggestion of NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman that Rogers make a deal with CBC. And well, what do you know, a W for Gary. At first, this seemed like a really good deal for hockey fans, as you didn't just have access to the regional game, but access to every Canadian team's game on Saturday night. For instance, you could watch the Leafs on CBC, the Habs on City, the Sens on Sportsnet East, and the Jets on Sportsnet 1. There was even coverage of games with only American teams on FX Canada, but that didn't last too long. However, Rogers was quick to make changes to the format of the show, not all of which were popular decisions, starting with the new host for Hockey Night, George Stroumboulopoulos. Strombo hosting Hockey Night in Canada while longtime host Ron MacLean got kicked aside to host hometown hockey on Sunday nights was quite the bombshell. I remember years later when he was talking to my radio class at Humber College that he was essentially brought in to raise viewership of women, which he did, but his reception was ultimately mixed. Strombo has a trademark energy that just kind of clashed with the straight-laced conservative talking heads that we usually get for sports shows. Strombo even hinted to us that there was kind of a culture clash behind the scenes as well. But let's be real, Strombo's true strength is as an interviewer, and while we did get some good interviews from him, it just wasn't a great fit for many. I just think he needed a little bit more time to grow into the role, which clearly Rogers wasn't willing to afford. Let's not forget that Conan O'Brien had some growing pains early on late night, but eventually evolved into one of the greatest talk show hosts of all time. Either way, Strombo would only last one season as host before Ron MacLean was brought back. Yay, more weird diatribes and bad puns. In 2019, Rogers forced legendary play-by-play man Bob Cole into retirement after a legendary 39-year run with the CBC. And let me add that hearing Bob Cole and Harry Neal every Saturday for all those years was just such a treat. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Don Cherry getting fired for his highly insensitive comments, taking aim at immigrants for not wearing poppies around Remembrance Day. Which, by the way, if you're going to get upset at any group of people not wearing poppies around Remembrance Day, I mean, take aim at my generation, millennials. And getting upset at new Canadians for not grasping the culture right away is just ridiculous. As you can tell, I wasn't crying when they put Grandpa to bed, but for a lot of Canadians, well, boomers, the show had lost a lot of appeal. And if you go on Facebook, you can see boomers to this day still claim that they haven't watched Hockey Night since Grapes was canned. But let's be real. Those guys aren't real hockey fans anyways. And despite claims that the ratings have fallen off since Cherry's firing, the data supplied by Numeris actually shows that the viewers have been pretty steady since Rogers took over. If anything, there was a bit of a dip in ratings from the transition from CBC to Rogers. Was this because of the Strombo factor or because the games were less accessible? Probably a bit of both if we're being honest. But Hockey Night in Canada still hung in there. Until now. As mentioned before, Rogers' national broadcasting deal with the NHL just expired this spring at the conclusion of the 2026 Stanley Cup Final. However, this April, it was announced that Rogers had come to another 12-year deal with the league. And while many thought they would continue to deal with the CBC, it was announced on June 16th that Rogers and CBC had mutually decided to not renew their contract. This marks the end of 95 years of the NHL on CBC, going back to radio broadcast in 1931 and TV broadcast starting in 1952. Hell, instant replay was invented for Hockey Night in Canada by CBC producer George Retzlaff. Apparently, CBC is developing a new sports show to replace Hockey Night in Canada. It's going to be focusing on Olympic athletes, kind of expanding on their Saturday daytime sports coverage. And while CBC still retains the Hockey Night in Canada brand, it's never going to be the same. Part of the magic of Hockey Night in Canada was that it was accessible to everybody on public television. But now with Rogers, the evil Canadian media empire at the helm, it's just about generating profit. They do have an obligation to drive revenue for their shareholders, but it's just sad that this era is over. Still, it's important to remember the good times, the fun memories, and all the magic of Hockey Night in Canada. Bob Cole perfectly describing the energy of the game. Brett Hull's controversial triple overtime winner to win the Stanley Cup in 1999, which I watched on tape, my first Hockey Night memory. Joe Nieuwendyk chasing Patrick Lalime from the net in Game 7. Crosby and Ovechkin's dueling hat tricks in their first ever playoff matchup. Matt Sundin's return to Toronto. Countless Stanley Cup final games. Watching players' faces light up when they get that iconic Hockey Night towel draped across their shoulders for their post-period interviews. I could go on forever, but there's just so many things that made Hockey Night in Canada special. In typical Canadian sports fan fashion, I'm cracking open this Canadian beer and saying cheers to Hockey Night in Canada. Thanks for the memories. Don't cry because it's over. Smile because it happened. And Rogers, don't this up. See you soon. Beer good. Thank you so much for clicking on this video and watching it until the end. You made me one very happy hockey fan. Please click that like button down below. Please let me know what you think. Please subscribe. And if you know anyone that you think would like this video, please share it with them. I know this is a bit different than my usual work, but I hope you enjoyed it anyways. See you soon, and let's keep the spirit of Hockey Night in Canada alive.